Hi. Section 47 of Counsels and Maxims is the beginning of Chapter 4 on worldly fortune. Here's what Schopenhauer tells us. However varied the forms that human destiny may take, the same elements are always present. And so life is everywhere much of a piece, whether it is passed in the cottage or in the palace, in the barrack or in the cloister. Alter the circumstances as much as you please. Point to strange adventures, successes, failures. Life is like a sweet shop where there is a great variety of things, odd in shape and diverse in color, one and all made from the same paste. And when men speak of someone's success, the lot of the man who has failed is not so very different as it seems. The inequalities in the world are like the combinations in a kaleidoscope. At every turn, a fresh picture strikes the eye, and yet in reality, you see only the same bit of glass as you saw before. That's section 47 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims. The main lesson to start us off on this chapter seeming to be that the differences in people's fate are really rather insignificant, that the difference between a successful life and a failed life are really not as remarkable as they might at first seem. In various circumstances, however much you like, between the barracks and the cloister, the palace and the cottage, people live more or less the same life, the same type of life, the same quality of life. For Schopenhauer, that is going to be, let's just say, bad. Life is bad. And then we have these two fantastic images. Life is like a sweet shop, sort of a Schopenhauerian version of Forrest Gump here, but rather than the lesson being, what was it from the movie, you never know what you're going to get, the lesson here is all the brightly colored candies of different shapes and sizes and elaborate things that strike the eye and entice the fancy, all of them are one and alike made from the same sugar paste. You put them in your mouth, exactly the same thing. Okay, the thing that strikes you about them as being different is ultimately insignificant. They are, in their substance, identical. And he's saying human lives are like that. Happy ones, sad ones, successful ones, failed ones, all made from the same content, the same low quality sugar paste. And then the other image of the kaleidoscope. You turn the kaleidoscope and you see bright images. Oh, wow, it's so sensational, so impressive when you're a young child. So in reality, what you're seeing is light reflected through the exact same piece of glass, couple of pieces of glass. There is nothing new there. There's only the appearance of change and difference and of dazzling heights and lows. There is, in fact, once you appreciate the objective reality of things, there is really very little variation actually happening, or in fact, none at all. So, a warning not to be deceived by appearances, and we might also say not to overinvest in what we see as being the differences between a happy life and a miserable one. In fact, it's all sugar paste. It's all the same low quality material. This life, Schopenhauer seems to say. So that's the end of section 47. The next two sections are rather long, so we'll take a look at those at length in the next couple of videos. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. In section 48 of Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer gives us an extended set of thoughts about the nature of chance and the role of fate, random chance in our lives. Here's what he writes. An ancient writer says, very truly, that there are three great powers in the world: sagacity, strength, and luck. Sunetos kratos tuku. I think the last is the most efficacious. A man's life is like the voyage of a ship, where luck, secunda aut adversa fortuna, acts the part of the wind, and speeds the vessel on its way, or drives it far out of its course. All that the man can do for himself is of little avail, like the rudder which, if worked hard and continuously, may help in the navigation of the ship, and yet all may be lost again by a sudden squall. But if the wind is only in the right quarter, the ship will sail on, and so as not to need any steering. The power of luck is nowhere better expressed than in a certain Spanish proverb: Da ventura a tu hijo y échalo en el mar. Give your son luck, and then throw him into the sea. So this first paragraph, Schopenhauer extolling the value of chance, saying of the three great forces in life: sagacity, your own wisdom and cleverness; strength, your own sort of force and social and material might; and luck. Luck is by far the greatest determinant of our life outcomes. If you happen, as the Spanish say, if you can only give your son luck, you can cast him into the ocean, and things will go well for him. Going on. Still, chance, it may be said, is a malignant power, and as little as possible should be left to its agency. And yet, where is there any giver who, in dispensing gifts, tells us quite clearly that we have no right to them, and that we owe them not to any merit on our part, but wholly to the goodness and grace of the giver, at the same time allowing us to cherish the joyful hope of receiving, in all humility, further undeserved gifts from the same hands? Where is there any giver like that, unless it be chance, who understands the kingly art of showing the recipient that all merit is powerless and unavailing against the royal grace and favor? Okay. Another great paragraph here, Schopenhauer telling us, noting that there's something kind of regal about chance, about fortune, about randomness, that unlike any other recipient, it tells us that its gifts are completely undeserved by us. It reminds me here very much of Fortuna from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Schopenhauer here, however, praising it. Right? What a glorious power differential there is between chance and us, between the giver and the recipient. No merit of ours can ever possibly account for what we get from chance. Chance, as it were, can say that to us the way nobody else can. Going on. On looking back over the course of his life, that labyrinthine way of error, a man must see many points where luck failed him and misfortune came. And then it is easy to carry self-reproach to an unjust excess. For the course of a man's life is in no wise entirely of his own making. It is the product of two factors: the series of things that happened, and his own resolves in regard to them. And these two are constantly interacting upon and modifying each other. And besides these, another influence is at work in the very limited extent of a man's horizon, whether it is that he cannot see very far ahead in respect of the plans he will adopt, or that he is still less able to predict the course of future events. His knowledge is strictly confined to present plans and present events. Hence, as long as a man's goal is far off, he cannot steer straight for it. He must be content to take a course that is approximately right, and in following the direction in which he thinks he ought to go, he will often have occasion to tack. I think part of what Schopenhauer is telling us here is very much the kind of dad advice that if your goal is far off, if you're aiming at something 10 years, 20 years distant, you can only make the most approximate move towards it. In other words, there is no precise right course to take now. You ought to think of yourself as moving in the general right direction. Okay, once you're closer, then you can adjust your final approach to actually attain the goal. But if the goal is far off, then all motion towards it is only need to be in approximately the right direction. I think that's a good way of calming us down when we become concerned about whether we're taking precisely the right action here and now to achieve a remote goal. Okay, the remote goal requires us to take a different sort of attitude towards the suitableness of the actions we take at the present time. So present actions, present events are what we react to immediately. And so I think that, plus I think the excellent expression describing human life as the labyrinthine way of error. good parts of that paragraph. Going on. All that a man can do is to form such resolves as from time to time accord with the circumstances in which he is placed, in the hope of thus managing to advance a step nearer towards his final goal. It is usually the case that the position in which we stand and the object at which we aim resemble two tendencies working with dissimilar strength in different directions, and the course of our life is represented by their diagonal or resultant force. And here's a nice image, right? The two rays, and we follow the vector between them. The rays are our ultimate goal, which we have in mind, and our present circumstances, and they are of different forces. And so we're sort of thinking back to geometry, taking the path between them is going to be determined by their relative strengths, and you'll move roughly in that direction. That's a nice geometrical image for the kind of advice that Schopenhauer is giving us here. Terence makes the remark that life is like a game at dice, where, if the number that turns up is not precisely the one you want, you can still contrive to use it equally well. Invita est hominum quasi cum ludus tesseris, si illud quod maxime opus est iactu non cadit, illud quod sedidit forte id arte ut corrigas. And that's my Latin's not great, but I think that's roughly, I looked it up, it's roughly in the life of men when you play at some kind of game, some kind of game where you throw dice and then use the results of the dice. If the thing that you most need does not come up, you don't throw the right number, of the thing which has fallen to you by chance, you have the skill. With skill, you can correct it. So, uh, approximately what Schopenhauer has said. Going on to Schopenhauer. Or, to put the matter more shortly, life is like a game of cards, when the cards are shuffled and dealt by fate. But for my present purpose, the most suitable simile would be that of a game of chess, where the plan we determine to follow is conditioned by the play of our rival, in life by the caprice of fate. We are compelled to modify our tactics, often to such an extent that, as we carry them out, hardly a single feature of the original plan can be recognized. So here's another great example of how to think about our lives like a game of chess. You have a plan of attack, of moving your pieces, of defense, and here it is chance, the caprice of chance, the things that happen in life more or less randomly, that will be playing the opposite pieces. And as in a game of chess, you modify or even abandon your opening plan according to the opportunities or the threats that are presented by the counterplay of the opponent. If fate presses you hard on one side, you modify or abandon your original plan to defend against that threat. If fate opens up some new opportunity for you, you advance down that side of the board, down that diagonal, as prudently as possible. So again, it's sort of the dad advice here of being able to think on your feet rather than thinking of life in terms of following a fixed plan. Going on now. But above and beyond all this, there is another influence that makes itself felt in our lives. It is a trite saying, only too frequently true, that we are often more foolish than we think. On the other hand, we are often wiser than we fancy ourselves to be. This, however, is a discovery which only those can make of whom it is really true, and it takes them a long time to make it. Our brains are not the wisest part of us. In the great moments of life, when a man decides upon an important step, his action is directed not so much by any clear knowledge of the right thing to do, as by an inner impulse. You may also almost call it an instinct, proceeding from the deepest foundations of his being. If, later on, he attempts to criticize his action by the light of hard and fast ideas of what is right in the abstract, those unprofitable ideas which are learnt by rote, or it may be borrowed from other people, if he begins to apply general rules, the principles which have guided others, to his own case, without sufficiently weighing the maxim that one man's meat is another man's poison, then he will run great risk of doing himself an injustice. The result will show where the right course lay. It is only when a man has reached the happy age of wisdom that he is capable of just judgment in regard either to his own actions or to those of others. A long paragraph beginning with this trite saying, we are often more foolish than we believe, and often we are wiser than we believe. Of course, this is only true of the people of whom it is true. But this interesting idea that when we're really making the critical decisions of our lives, a job, a marriage, some sort of radical change, we often find that we are not making them from some sort of clear intellectual idea of what principle requires, but rather out of a sort of a deep well of influences that have affected us. In other words, we sort of act from our deepest being when we make these kinds of decisions. And if looking back later upon those decisions, the decision to begin or end that relationship, the decision to abandon this job and move cross country, or not to do so, to pass up the opportunity to enlist in the military, etc. If we look back on those sorts of decisions that proceed from the core of our being, and look at them in the light of these unprofitable abstract ideas that we borrow from other people, that other people have put into our heads, we will reproach ourselves and even do damage to ourselves without cause. Schopenhauer seems to say, do ourselves an injustice. So it is only at the happy age of wisdom that you win the sort of right to be able to judge effectively of your own life, what your own life is and has become. You might say there's a certain kind of self-knowledge of your own deepest self and principles and motivations that comes only with old age. That as a young person, you might be more inclined to misjudge yourself according to abstract principles that don't necessarily apply to you and to your circumstances and situation. Schopenhauer goes on. It may be that this impulse or instinct is the unconscious effect of a kind of prophetic dream, which is forgotten when we awake, lending our life a uniformity of tone, a dramatic unity, such as could never result from the unstable moments of consciousness, when we are so easily led into error, so liable to strike a false note. It is in virtue of some such prophetic dream that a man feels himself called to great achievements in a special sphere, and works in that direction from his youth up out of an inner and secret feeling that this is his true path, just as by a similar instinct the bee is led to build up its cells in the comb. This is the impulse which Balthasar Gracian calls la gran synderisis, the great power of moral discernment. It is something that a man instinctively feels to be his salvation, without which he were lost. An interesting commentary now here about this kind of prophetic dream, unconscious prophetic dream, maybe a sort of sense of self that we have that we forget when awake, right? A sense that I am meant to do this. This is the right thing for me. I don't think Schopenhauer is really getting mystical here so much as he's referring to the fact that there's a great deal going on in us below the level of conscious mind and intellectual knowledge and choosing. It's not a matter of knowing principles and applying them to life. It's more a matter of being and becoming what we are. And that's the sort of feel that I'm getting off of this. So now the final paragraph of the section, Schopenhauer writes, "To act in accordance with abstract principles is a difficult matter, and a great deal of practice will be required before you can be even occasionally successful. It often happens that the principles do not fit in with your particular case. But every man has certain innate concrete principles, a part, as it were, of the very blood that flows in his veins, the sum or result, in fact, of all his thoughts, feelings, and volitions. Usually, he has no knowledge of them in any abstract form. It is only when he looks back upon the course that his life has taken that he becomes aware of having been always led on by them, as though they formed an invisible clue which he had followed unawares." That's the end of section 48 of Counsels and Maxims. And a very Nietzschean note, I think, in fact, that there is every man has concrete principles, sort of the personality that he has formed, the very blood in his veins, the thought, feelings, and volitions that make him up. This is the kind of thing which one acquires, it seems, a greater knowledge of the older and wiser one becomes, looking back on your life, seeing now, these have been the principles of my life. Not abstract ones that are known intellectually, but these concrete principles that I know, it seems, through the kind of semi-subconscious, deep experience of being me, of reflecting upon myself and acquiring this kind of knowledge, a kind of invisible clue that I've been following my whole life that's led me to the place where I am now. So, an interesting set of reflections upon the nature of chance and its large role in our life, with some advice on how we should think about it, how we should govern ourselves, and avoid useless self reproach, especially in cases where fate has turned against us. So that's section 48 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims. We'll talk about section 49 in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. In section 49 of Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer discusses time and change and how we should react to the knowledge that everything in this world is transitory. He concludes with some advice about not becoming time's debtor. He begins, that time works great changes, and that all things are in their nature fleeting, these are truths that should never be forgotten. Hence, in whatever case you may be, it is well to picture yourself the opposite. In prosperity, be mindful of misfortune. In friendship, of enmity. In good weather, of days when the sky is overcast. In love, of hatred. In moments of trust, to imagine the betrayal that will make you regret your confidence. And so too when you are in evil plight, to have a lively sense of happier times. What a lasting source of true worldly wisdom were there. We should then always reflect and not be so very easily deceived, because in general you should anticipate the very changes that the years will bring. It sounds almost like a kind of Schopenhauerian version of the prayer of St. Francis, where there's hatred, let me sow love. Schopenhauer says, when you experience love, think of hatred. When you are trusting someone, think of betrayal. Because in this world, all things necessarily will change. You should be prepared for the change that will inevitably happen. And consider the opposite of whatever you are experiencing, whether it be good or evil. This, he says, is part of the essence of worldly wisdom. So he goes on. Perhaps in no form of knowledge is personal experience so indispensable as in learning to see that all things are unstable and transitory in this world. There is nothing that in its own place and for the time it lasts is not a product of necessity, and therefore capable of being fully justified. And it is this fact that makes the circumstances of every year, every month, even of every day, seem as though they might maintain their right to last to all eternity. But we know that this can never be the case, and that in a world where all is fleeting, change alone endures. He is a prudent man who is not only undeceived by apparent stability, but is able to forecast the lines upon which movement will take place. So, another paragraph, the only stable thing in this world is change. Although there is necessity, it is the necessity of things which deludes us into thinking that they will be unchangeable, and this is an error. There's a footnote at the end of this paragraph, and here's the footnote. Chance plays so great a part in all human affairs that when a man tries to ward off a remote danger by present sacrifice, the danger often vanishes under some new and unforeseen development of events. And then the sacrifice, in addition to being a complete loss, brings about such an altered state of things as to be in itself a source of positive danger in the face of this new development. In taking measures of precaution, then, it is well not to look too far ahead, but to reckon with chance, and often to oppose a courageous front to a danger in the hope that, like many a dark thundercloud, it may pass away without breaking. That's the end of the footnote. A footnote about chance. Interesting as well. We expect change, but we also expect that the dangers that we see coming may not come. And so it is a good advice in taking precautions not to plan too far ahead, shades of something that we said before about having a plan in the game of chess, but leaving room for a certain amount of luck in response to circumstances. If you plan too far ahead, you'll find yourself creating new hazards and traps for yourself. And then also simply putting up a brave front and hoping that the danger you foresee may pass like a dark cloud overhead without breaking, without raining on you. So back to the main text now. But people generally think that present circumstances will last, and that matters will go in the future as they have done in the past. Their mistake arises from the fact that they do not understand the causes of the things they see, causes which, unlike the effects they produce, contain in themselves the germ of future change. The effects are all that people know, and they hold fast to them on the supposition that those unknown causes, which were sufficient to bring them about, will also be able to maintain them as they are. This is a very common error, and the fact that it is common is not without its advantage, for it means that people always err in unison, and hence the calamity which results from the error affects all alike, and is therefore easy to bear. Whereas, if a philosopher makes a mistake, he is alone in his error, and so at a double disadvantage. Two things in this paragraph I think noteworthy. First, that last one, it seems there's a further burden that the philosopher or the wise man must bear, which is that his mistakes are mistakes in which he enjoys little or no company. When he makes a mistake, it is his fault, but also he has no fellows who are in the same boat to sympathize with him or to endure the results of the mistake with him. It's quite the opposite with common errors. The more common they are, the more that the sort of collective society is entirely invested in them and is able at least to bear up the consequences together. So the sort of ship of fools sails on, enduring all of their errors in unison and together, whereas I suppose if I'm pushing the metaphor, I might say that the wise man is in a rowboat by himself, enduring the hazards that come his way solo. But this is the burden that they must bear. The other point I thought from this paragraph, this idea that the mistake people make is to suppose that is to stick with the effects. They see the effects, but they don't see the causes. Now, the causes have this necessity to them, according to Schopenhauer, and the causes have in them also the germ of future effects. To understand the causes is really to see how things are going to go. But people who see the surface only, who don't get behind appearances to the reality of things, people who go only from effects, assume that whatever caused this effect to be the way it is now is capable of causing this effect to be that way forever. And so they make forever plans. They plan on things being just the same as they are, continuing as they are. This is a common error, but it is an error. So it's connected with this superficiality of the ordinary understanding of the world, I think Schopenhauer is saying. There's a footnote attached to the end of this paragraph again, a shorter one, and here it is. I may remark parenthetically that all this is a confirmation of the principle laid down in Weltanschauung und Vorstellung, that error always consists in making a wrong inference, that is, in ascribing a given effect to something that does not cause it. Okay. The reference there is to Book 1, page 94 of The World as Will and Representation. That might be an interesting detail to chase down later on. I'm going to go back to the main text now. Schopenhauer continues. But in saying that we should anticipate the effects of time, I mean that we should mentally forecast what they are likely to be. I do not mean that we should practically forestall them by demanding the immediate performance of promises which time alone can fulfill. The man who makes this demand will find out that there is no worse or more exacting usurer than time, and that if you compel time to give money in advance, you will have to pay a rate of interest more ruinous than any Jew would require. It is possible, for instance, to make a tree burst forth into leaf, blossom, or even bear fruit within a few days by the application of unslaked lime and artificial heat, but after that the tree will wither away. So, a young man may abuse his strength, it may be only for a few weeks, by trying to do at 19 what he could easily manage at 30, and time may give him the loan for which he asks, but the interest he will have to pay comes out of the strength of his later years. Nay, it is part of his very life itself. This image I like very much of time as a usurer. You can borrow from it by demanding advance payment, demanding the ability to do now at age 19 what you might be able to do with more skill and training and strength at age 30. You might get away with that, but the ultimate price you're paying is coming out of the later part of your life, which will be more full of suffering and pain as a result of your sort of spendthrift ways in your youth. It's possible to abuse your body, your mind, your overall life. I think this is part of what Schopenhauer means by going into time's debt. Time is a usurer and a very vicious one. So you don't want to borrow in large quantities from time. Time here is spelled each time with a capital T. Going on. There are some kinds of illness in which restoration to health is possible only by letting the complaint run its natural course, after which it disappears without leaving any trace of its existence. But if the sufferer is very impatient, and while he is still affected, insists that he is completely well, in this case too, time will grant the loan, and the complaint may be shaken off. But lifelong weakness and chronic mischief will be the interest paid upon it. Another good example of going into debt to time, to not to invest the time to await a full recovery from an illness, but to get up and resume arduous work while you're still only, we might say, 70 or 80% recovered. You can get away with that. Time will pay you, but it will extract interest, Schopenhauer says. And this may be something that's more familiar to us than his example about the forcing a tree to bloom in a short time. That, yeah, if you do return to work, you overdo it, you end up paying it back. And this is a debt that you pay to time. Why? Because you were impatient, because you demanded now what you could have had if you'd been more patient and willing to give time its way. Next paragraph. Again, in time of war or general disturbance, a man may require ready money at once, and have to sell out his investments in land or consols for a third or even a still smaller fraction of the sum he would have received for them if he could have waited for the market to right itself, which would have happened in due course. But he compels time to grant him a loan, and his loss is the interest he has to pay. Or perhaps he wants to go on a long journey and requires money. In 1 or 2 years he could lay a sufficient sum out of his income, but he cannot afford to wait. And so he either borrows it or deducts it from his capital. In other words, he gets time to lend him the money in advance. The interest he pays is a disordered state of his accounts and permanent and increasing deficits, which he can never make good. Such is time's usury, and all who cannot wait are its victims. There is no more thriftless proceeding than to try and mend the measured pace of time. Be careful, then, not to become its debtor. This is, in a way, a development of earlier advice about patience. You must be patient. You do not want the third example here. I think was a great one, right? If you need money right now, I have to have the money for a journey or for something else. If you have to sell in a down market, you are the loser. Whereas if you could wait for the market to right itself, for the properties to return to their historic value, then you would have the same thing at the cost of having waited a while longer. So there's something going on here, sort of early version perhaps of time value, Schopenhauer's version of time value of money, that if you demand now what you could have in the future at lower cost, you are, in a sense, paying interest to that usurer time. And Schopenhauer's advice, his kind of worldly wisdom, is don't do that. That's not worth it. Not a good practice. So that is section 49 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims. We'll take a look at section 50 in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Here's section 50 of Schopenhauer's Counsels and Maxims. In the daily affairs of life, you will have very many opportunities of recognizing a characteristic difference between ordinary people and people of prudence and discretion. In estimating the possibility of danger in connection with any undertaking, an ordinary man will confine his inquiries to the kind of risk that has already attended such undertakings in the past, whereas a prudent person will look ahead and consider everything that might possibly happen in the future, having regard to a certain Spanish maxim, lo que no aquece en un año, aquece en un rato. A thing may not happen in a year, and yet may happen within 2 minutes. The difference in question is, of course, quite natural, for it requires some amount of discernment to calculate possibilities, but a man need only have his senses about him to see what has already happened. Okay. That's the first half of section 50. And there's an interesting distinction Schopenhauer makes here between the common person, the person of common intellect, and the person of prudence and discretion. He says, you will observe this. They both behave with a certain amount of regard for their safety, for the success of their projects, guarding against failure. But the sort of ordinary conservatism of the common man is a matter of kind of induction from past events. He looks at the past, he sees what's gone wrong in the past, and he tries to ensure his future practices against just those sorts of problems. And this is satisfactory, but this kind of induction is just barely satisfactory. The true person of discretion will anticipate the unprecedented, will be able to look ahead and see the possibilities implicit in the situation, we might say both for advantage and for disadvantage, that have no historical precedent, that are not obvious from a sort of basic inductive reading of a data set of the past. So I think Schopenhauer is drawing a distinction here between a sort of common sense type of reasoning about the security of our future affairs and the true sort of person of genius who will see what no one else has seen, who will anticipate what no one else has anticipated about the dangers that are implicit in a certain type of situation. To do that, he has to go beyond what the historical record reveals to the ordinary mind. Section 50 goes on. Do not omit to sacrifice to evil spirits. What I mean is that a man should not hesitate about spending time, trouble, and money, or giving up comfort, or restricting his aims and denying himself, if he can thereby shut the door on the possibility of misfortune. The most terrible misfortunes are also the most improbable and remote, the least likely to occur. The rule I am giving is best exemplified in the practice of insurance, a public sacrifice made on the altar of anxiety. Therefore, take out your policy of insurance. That's the end of section 50. And I don't know, and I haven't investigated, whether insurance in German meant the same thing in 1850 that it means for us today. I assume, on the basis of the accuracy of the translation, that there's something comparable going on. We make a sacrifice on the altar of anxiety. We give up present goods, present money, against a remote possibility of our own death, of our house burning down, of a flood, etc. Why? Because we are willing to, the great expression of Schopenhauer's, make sacrifices to evil spirits, right? There's a sort of evil fire demon that might consume my house. I sacrifice a couple of hundred, a couple of $1,000s now against the possibility that that might happen. So this is another element of the way in which the truly wise, the truly prudent, the truly discerning person governs his affairs with a sort of creative look at not just uh, precedented hazards, but unprecedented hazards, and taking caution against those. And a great deal of present sacrifice and discomfort is justified if it can shut the door against a future misfortune, including the greatest misfortunes, which are the ones that we do not anticipate. So, seems to be a good set of observations here about the nature of prudence and the way in which the sort of prudence of the genius or the person of true discernment and wisdom will differ from the kind of general induction from the data of the past that will characterize ordinary intellects. Section 51 of Counsels and Maxims is next, and this is where Schopenhauer will speak to us about how to endure misfortune in this life. We'll look at that in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Hi. In section 51 of Counsels and Maxims, Schopenhauer advises us to meet the misfortunes of our life with a certain calm, stoical spirit. He explains how this will reduce our overall subjective suffering and explains why this is so, why it is that thinking out in advance the nature and extent of the various calamities that we face will help us to meet them well and with a lower level of distress than might afflict other people. He connects this again to his determinism as the key insight. You must keep always in mind, he says, that all things happen of necessity. And he concludes by advising us on how to meet the petty vexations of daily life, the little annoyances that we face in living among and dealing with other people. Here's how he begins. Whatever fate befalls you, do not give way to great rejoicings or great lamentation, partly because all things are full of change, and your misfortune may turn at any moment, and partly because men are so apt to be deceived in their judgment as to what is good or bad for them. That is to say, your fate may turn out to be not as bad or as good as you expect it to be, or you may simply be mistaken. You may have misjudged the circumstances. Almost everyone in his time has lamented over something which afterwards turned out to be the very best thing for him that could have happened, or rejoiced at an event which became the source of his greatest sufferings. The right state of mind has been finely portrayed by Shakespeare. I have felt so many quirks of joy and grief that the first face of neither, on the start, can woman me unto't. And that's a quote from All's Well That Ends Well. And in general, it may be said that if a man takes misfortunes quietly, it is because he knows that very many dreadful things may happen in the course of life, and so he looks upon the trouble of the moment as only a very small part of that which might come. This is the Stoic temper, never to be unmindful of the sad fate of humanity, conditiones humanae oblitus, forgetting the human condition, but always to remember that our existence is full of woe and misery, and that the ills to which we are exposed are innumerable. Wherever he be, a man need only cast a look around to revive the sense of human misery. There before his eyes he can see mankind struggling and floundering in torment, all for the sake of a wretched existence, barren and unprofitable. If he remembers this, a man will not expect very much from life, but learn to accommodate himself to a world where all is relative and no perfect state exists, always looking misfortune in the face, and if he cannot avoid it, meeting it with courage. That's the end of the first page of section 51. And we have here uh, general advice about Stoicism, Schopenhauer's Stoicism. Keep in mind that life is suffering, life is pain, humanity is subject to a huge variety of misfortune, and the ones that are happening to you now are only a small subset of them. So there's a great many more misfortunes that were possible that are not happening to you right now. If you keep that firmly in mind, you will, he says, have the right sort of attitude. And if you ever are ignorant of or beginning to forget the state of mankind, simply look around at your fellow man, and you will see that suffering and struggling and floundering for an unprofitable and barren existence is the common state of all people. So again, sort of very, very Schopenhauerian pessimism, right? If you remember this, then you'll learn not to expect very much from life. So what you get, well, it's bad, but it's certainly not as bad as it could have been. And there's your consolation. Okay. He also speaks of avoiding troubles where we can, but meeting the ones we cannot avoid with courage. We'll see him talk about courage again in a few sections at the end of this chapter. So Schopenhauer goes on. It should never be forgotten that misfortune, be it great or small, is the element in which we live. But that is no reason why a man should indulge in fretful complaints, and, like Beresford, pull a long face over the miseries of human life. And not a single hour is free from them, or still less, call upon the deity at every flea bite, in pullicis morsu deum invocare. That just means what he just said, to call upon God at the biting of fleas. Our aim should be to look well about us, to ward off misfortune by going to meet it, to attain such perfection and refinement in averting the disagreeable things of life, whether they come from our fellow men or from the physical world, that, like a clever fox, we may slip out of the way of every mishap, great or small, remembering that a mishap is generally only our own awkwardness in disguise. Again, the idea that we ought not to expect very much from this life, and that we ought not to fill our time with idle complaints or groaning at every flea bite invoking the name of God. Instead, avoid what can be avoided, endure what must be endured, and keep in mind that frequently our misfortunes are our own folly and stupidity come back to punish us. He goes on. The main reason why misfortune falls less heavily upon us if we have looked upon its occurrence as not impossible, and as the saying is, prepared ourselves for it, may be this. If, before the misfortune comes, we have quietly thought over it as something which may or may not happen, the whole of its extent and range is known to us, and we can at least determine how far it will affect us, so that, if it really arrives, it does not depress us unduly, its weight is not felt to be greater than it actually is. Okay? Suggesting there's a certain kind of realism here in anticipating misfortune, thinking ahead. And what would I do if my house burned down? Well, now that I've considered that, I've considered how deeply it would affect me. It's not unknown. Schopenhauer again. But if no preparation has been made to meet it, and it comes unexpectedly, the mind is in a state of terror for the moment and unable to measure the full extent of the calamity. It seems so far-reaching in its effects that the victim might well think there was no limit to them. In any case, its range is exaggerated. Okay. And again, this is kind of a subjective knowledge problem. If I haven't thought out just how badly I would be affected by this potential misfortune, when the misfortune comes upon me, the wave looks 1,000 feet tall. I'm unable to estimate its significance, its extent, and it's the damage that I'm likely to endure from it. So I've considered this case ahead of time. I have the advantage of a certain kind of realism in my reaction to it. So to recommend a certain kind of stoic anticipation of suffering. In the same way, darkness and uncertainty always increase the sense of danger. And of course, if we have thought over the possibility of misfortune, we have also at the same time considered the sources to which we shall look for help and consolation, or at any rate, we have accustomed ourselves to the idea of it. There is nothing that better fits us to endure the misfortunes of life with composure than to know for certain that everything that happens, from the smallest up to the greatest facts of existence, happens of necessity. Yeah, that last part is in italics, and Schopenhauer gives the footnote. This is a truth which I have firmly established in my prize essay on the freedom of the will, where the reader will find a detailed explanation of the grounds on which it rests. Back to the main text. A man soon accommodates himself to the inevitable, to something that must be. And if he knows that nothing can happen except of necessity, he will see that things cannot be other than they are, and that even the strangest chances in the world are just as much a product of necessity as phenomena which obey well-known rules and turn out exactly in accordance with expectation. Let me here refer to what I have said elsewhere on the soothing effect of the knowledge that all things are inevitable and the product of necessity. And his footnote here is to Weltwille und Vorstellung, Book 1, page 361 of the 4th edition. If a man is steeped in the knowledge of this truth, he will, first of all, do what he can, and then readily endure what he must. I think that the invocation of a determinism here is meant to indicate that there's a certain kind of mental distress we feel from supposing that things could have been otherwise, that we've made a mistake, that we've brought things upon ourselves that we might not have brought upon ourselves. If I think of my suffering in the moment that I'm enduring it as being the product of necessity, it had to happen this way. It could not conceivably have happened otherwise. Then it is easy to endure, just as the things that are unexpected which come upon me, sudden toothache or some disaster that afflicts me, is just as endurable as a thing which happens entirely in accordance with our predictions. If I drop a marble down a ramp, it rolls down the ramp exactly along the path which is determined by physics. If I can have that sort of comfort, calm, and detachment in looking at the events of my life, the ones that affect me, cause me personal distress and suffering, then that sort of determinism regarding those events brings that same kind of calm detachment that I would attach to watching marbles roll in accordance with the laws of physics. Back to Schopenhauer now. We may regard the petty vexations of life that are constantly happening as designed to keep us in practice for bearing great misfortunes, so that we may not become completely enervated by a career of prosperity. Like that's a neat idea that the sort of the minor annoyances we have to deal with are sort of keeping us in practice, keeping us in form, allowing us to keep our muscle tone, so to speak, with regard to dealing with larger calamities that really will affect us more deeply. He goes on. A man should be a Siegfried, armed cap à pie, towards these small troubles of every day, those little differences we have with our fellow men, insignificant disputes, unbecoming conduct in other people, petty gossip, and many other similar annoyances of life. He should not feel them at all, much less take them to heart and brood over them, but hold them at arm's length and push them out of his way like stones that lie in the road, and upon no account think about them and give them a place in his reflections. So the suggestion here at the end of section 51 now, is that the wise person will regard these petty annoyances of daily life as a kind of training ground for endurance. But honestly, when we come down to it, his attitude ought to be to simply brush them aside, give them no mind whatsoever. They're not worthy of consideration, and in not feeling them at all, he will be gradually training himself for the harder task of enduring and adopting a kind of stoic detachment from the distress that he might feel at greater calamities that afflict him, greater than just minor annoyances like gossip or bad behavior by one's fellow man. So that brings us to the end of section 51 and Schopenhauer's advice about facing misfortune. We'll look at section 52 in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Section 52 of Counsels and Maxims is about fate. Here's what Schopenhauer writes. What people commonly call fate is, as a general rule, nothing but their own stupid and foolish conduct. There is a fine passage in Homer illustrating the truth of this remark, where the poet praises Metis, shrewd counsel, and his advice is worthy of all attention. I'm going to pause here because the footnote that Schopenhauer gives references the Iliad, book 23, line 313. And I've actually found that, so I'm going to share it with you here. Let me pull it up on the screen. This is Antilochus's father giving him advice about horse racing. He says, Antilochus, for all thou art young, yet have Zeus and Poseidon loved thee and taught thee all manner of horsemanship. Wherefore to teach thee is no great need, for thou knowest well how to wheel about the turning post. Yet are thy horses slowest in the race. Therefore I deem there will be sorry work for thee. The horses of the others are swifter, but the men know not how to devise more cunning counsel than thine own self. Wherefore come, dear son, lay thou up in thy mind cunning of every sort, to the end that the prizes escape thee not. By cunning, thou knowest, is a woodman far better than might. By cunning, too, doth a helmsman on the wine dark deep guide aright a swift ship that is buffeted by winds. And by cunning doth charioteer prove better than charioteer. Another man, trusting in his horses and car, heedlessly wheeleth wide to this side and that, and his horses roam over the course, neither keepeth he them in hand. Whereas he that hath crafty mind, albeit he drive worse horses, keepeth his eye ever on the turning post, and wheeleth close thereby, neither is unmindful how at the first to force his horses with the ox-hide reins, but keepeth them ever in hand, and watcheth the man that leadeth him in the race. So that's the passage from Homer, which I think is really excellent and worth having at hand when we're considering that Schopenhauer recommends his advice about shrewd counsel in the face of fate. He goes on. For if wickedness is atoned for only in another world, stupidity gets its reward here, although now and then mercy may be shown to the offender. It's a good image, Schopenhauerian twist, that wickedness is punished in the afterlife. Stupidity is punished quite often in this life, though occasionally the world will be merciful and let the stupid get by without injury. It is not ferocity, but cunning, that strikes fear into the heart and forebodes danger. So true it is that the human brain is a more terrible weapon than the lion's paw. The most finished man of the world would be one who was never irresolute and never in a hurry. That's the end of section 52. I think a great invocation, especially that passage from Homer, which I included here, of the value of shrewd cunning of Metis in Homer's phrase as a remedy against fate. What people call fate, what people might call bad luck, is more often than not their own stupidity and foolishness come back to punish them in this lifetime. So the person of shrewdness, like the father advises in Homer, is the person who will, although he drives worse horses, slower horses, be able, by the application of his mind, to achieve a faster result, to win the victory nevertheless. So that's the end of section 52 of Counsels and Maxims. We'll talk about section 53 in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye. Section 53 of Counsels and Maxims is the final section of Chapter 4 on worldly fortune, and the subject is courage. Here it is. Courage comes next to prudence as a quality of mind very essential to happiness. It is quite true that no one can endow himself with either, since a man inherits prudence from his mother and courage from his father. Still, if he has these qualities, he can do much to develop them by means of resolute exercise. In this world, where the game is played with loaded dice, a man must have a temper of iron, with armor proof to the blows of fate, and weapons to make his way against men. Life is one long battle. We have to fight at every step. And Voltaire very rightly says that if we succeed, it is at the point of the sword, and that we die with the weapon in our hand. On ne réussit dans ce monde qu'à la pointe de l'épée, et on meurt les armes à la main. One succeeds in this world only at the point of the sword, the épée, and one dies with those weapons in the hand, as Schopenhauer said. It is a cowardly soul that shrinks or grows faint and despondent as soon as the storm begins to gather, or even when the first cloud appears on the horizon. Our motto should be no surrender, and far from yielding to the ills of life, let us take fresh courage from misfortune. Tu ne sede malis, sed contra audentior ito. This is a quote from Virgil from the Aeneid, Book 6. Do not give way to evil, but go still bolder against it. As long as the issue of any matter fraught with peril is still in doubt, and there is yet some possibility left that all may come right, no one should ever tremble or think of anything but resistance. Just as a man should not despair of the weather if he can see a bit of blue sky anywhere. Let our attitude be such that we should not quake even if the world fell in ruins about us. Si fractus illabatur urbis, impavidum ferient ruinae. This is a quote from Horace's Odes 3:3. If the shattered world collapsed, it would strike him fearless, referring to the man of courage. He would be unaffected. He would not collapse or retreat, even if the world were falling down upon him. Our whole life itself, let alone its blessings, would not be worth such a cowardly trembling and shrinking of the heart. Therefore, let us face life courageously and show a firm front to every ill. Quo circa vivite fortes, fortiaque adversis opponite pectora rebus. Schopenhauer gives no footnote for this, so I don't know what the source is for the Latin quote, but it means live strong and set your breast, your pectora, against things that oppose you with courage. Still, it is possible for courage to be carried to an excess and to degenerate into rashness. It may even be said that some amount of fear is necessary if we are to exist at all in the world, and cowardice is only the exaggerated form of it. This truth has been very well expressed by Bacon in his account of terror panicus, and the etymological account which he gives of its meaning is very superior to the ancient explanation preserved for us by Plutarch. He connects the expression with Pan, the personification of nature, and observes that fear is innate in every living thing, and in fact tends to its preservation, but that it is apt to come into play without due cause, and that man is especially exposed to it. The chief feature of this panic terror is that there is no clear notion of any definite danger bound up with it, that it presumes rather than knows that danger exists, and that, in case of need, it pleads fright itself as the reason for being afraid. That's the end of section 53 and the end of chapter 4 of Counsels and Maxims by Schopenhauer. A fascinating passage I'm not familiar with previously about panic terror, terror panicus, as described by Francis Bacon, that connected with this personification of nature, the god Pan, right? Pan, what happens? You feel this panic. Why? This is a sort of terror with no cause. This is fear, the natural fear in each person, but acting without cause, without a sort of objective correlate to inspire it. And it sounds, frighteningly similar to things we might call anxiety in our own day, right? There's no clear notion of any definite danger, and yet we still feel terror. It presumes rather than knows that danger exists, so there's no sort of active intellect of knowledge concluding that there is danger. There's simply this sort of the panic that grips the spirit. And in the end, if we need some cause for being afraid, it is simply the feeling of fright itself, sort of feeding upon itself. So this idea here that there is this kind of fear, which maybe is necessary part of human condition to keep us alive, but which can be carried to an excess in certain cases. And this meditation upon this panic terror described by Bacon, I think quite interesting. The rest of the section really just about the nature of courage, no surrender, right? Face things, though the heavens fall, let us face all things with resolute courage. As long as there's any chance of success, we should not despair or give up. So, good, solid advice, I think, for dealing with worldly fortune by Arthur Schopenhauer. We will turn to the beginning of the final chapter of this book titled The Ages of Life in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.